Just the calm before the storm. Getting yourself in the zone so you're ready to take notes. It's very quiet. Do that, you just had lunch. And all right, I really need to take a nap. All right, let's begin so then we can end. A few business items first. Your first discussion board in the clay book. I think about 25 or 40 are in so far. I did extend that deadline to tonight. So get that first one in if you have not already. I think everything I've seen in has been graded so far. Did I send something out about an extra credit opportunity, the Constitution Day thing? So I tend to give a lot of extra credit, but closer to the beginning of the semester. You got to take advantage of when I offer it. A lot of students will not do the extra credit at the end of the semester, find themselves in a bit of a hole. Then they'll come say, hey, can I do extra credit? And at that point, no, you can't. You got to do the extra credit when it's available. So there's extra credit opportunities built into the discussion board. There'll be other extra credit opportunities that pop up, special events and things like that. Some other things along the way. So take advantage of the extra credit opportunities when they come. They really do help. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. Remember, I told you not to rely upon me recording the lectures, and that happened in the very first lecture. I think I know what the problem is. I think I had, because I had the computer audio plugged in, I think that's why it did not record me. So I'm doing it, I'm using Zoom again. If it doesn't work again this time, then I'll switch over to a different recording software that I have. But we'll try it again this time. But just be aware there is no recording of Thursday's lecture. Hopefully there'll be a recording of today's lecture. I will not post those though until it gets closer to like actual test time. All right. So the ideal is that you are here paying attention, taking notes, and on and on. Or recording me too. You're fine to record me. Okay. Any questions about that? Then let's get to it. We are continuing our discussion of the culture wars. Remember, I said that in times and places in the New World, we need to think of Native Americans and Europeans as occupying a middle ground. One side or the other could not dominate the other. And so they found themselves having to compete with each other on peace, maybe not peaceful, but on cultural grounds, right? Well, we are so used to telling the story from one direction. Europeans were trying to convince Native Americans that the European way of life was better. We don't focus enough on the ways in which Native Americans were trying to convince Europeans that the Native American way of life was better, right? Both sides competed with each other. Native Americans trying to, we saw this at the end of the lecture on Thursday, right? Europeans were trying to convert, baptize Native Americans. Native Americans were trying to adopt Europeans at a kind of general level. You adopt the English, adopt the French into the Iroquois nation, for instance, but also adopting at interpersonal levels too. I told you the story of Old White Chief. At a diplomatic level, adoption didn't really work. At an interpersonal level, Jesuit priests traveled around and they said, in some of these villages, this is 1760s, 1770s, when the Iroquois are increasingly adopting more people because increasingly their numbers are more depleted by disease, by war. Jesuit priests are traveling around, they're in Iroquois villages and they're saying, maybe 2/3 are foreigners. They're not even native, they're not even native-born Iroquois anymore. Their Huron or Algonquin have been adopted. They're Europeans who have been adopted into these tribes, right? Story after story after story of Native Americans adopting the rival Native Americans or adopting Europeans, the so-called white Indians. So we continue that story today, although we begin to shift from a French to an English context where there's less middle ground. And had to start on kind of a sad note. Yeah, we gotta talk about Pocahontas. All right, you guys you grew up watching the Disney Pocahontas. You've seen this movie. What's the Pocahontas story about? It's a story of intercultural love, right? It's John Smith and Pocahontas's dad, Powhatan, wanting to kill him, and Pocahontas saves his life, and they live happily ever after, right? And it shows that in the New World, love can triumph over hate, right? That's the story. That's the message of Pocahontas, that true love across cultures is possible. That's not the real meaning of Pocahontas' story. The Pocahontas story that I'm going to tell today is actually a story of two failed adoptions. I'm going to have to bust a lot of myths here along the way. First one, her name's not Pocahontas. The English called her Amanut. Her native name was Matoka. Pocahontas means playful girl. Most of the Native American children that the English encountered, they call Pocahontas. Young girls, they call them Pocahontas. So you'll hear me refer to Amanut, Matoka, Pocahontas, it's all the same person. Matoka was the daughter of Powhatan. Powhatan was the chief of an Algonquin confederacy. We talked about the Iroquois Confederacy around the Great Lakes region. Powhatan, in the years before the English come and settled, you'll be reading about the English settlement in the Maclay book. 1607, the English settled in present-day Virginia, Jamestown. You'll be reading, you'll get that factual information from Maclay. At the time that the English were settling, Powhatan had consolidated power around this kind of region of present-day Virginia, the Chesapeake region. It was a confederacy. It was different Native American, not just tribes, different Native American nations that Powhatan brought under his leadership. He was a big man in the region, literally a big man, quite tall. And he had a daughter, Matoka, Amanut, who he used. Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Who he used It's kind of like an ambassador. And so Powhatan is just kind of consolidated power in this region when these scruffy palefaces start showing up in Virginia, around present-day Jamestown. And Powhatan's like, "Why are they here to hurt us? Can I maybe use these people? Can I bring them into the? Can I bring them in? All the kinds of confusion I said that Americans have today when they're trying to think about, all right, who should we let in? How should we let them in? How many should we let in? And where should we let them in? And how should we do it? All these kinds of confusions that we have. We don't even know how to complete a sentence when it comes to immigration. Native Americans had those same kinds of conflicts going on too. What do we do? How do I deal with these people? And so Powhatan sent Matoka over to Jamestown. Matoka became known as Pocahontas. Like to do naked cartwheels around the camp, which got the attention of the English settlers. Playful girl. And when John Smith came in to kind of, look, that you'll read about the English settlement. It was a nightmare. It was by people who had no business whatsoever being out in the woods. It's kind of like a group of freshmen going to Cedar Bend. It's a bit like that, right? Just don't fall into the trap that the English settlers did. All right, when your PA tells you to go collect wood so you can start a fire so you can have breakfast, do that. All right, don't go start looking for gold around Cedar Bend. It's not there, and it wasn't there in Virginia either. But that's what they did. They just thought they could get off the boat, and it was somehow like Central America. They was going pick up some gold, put it on the boat, sail back to England, good to go. So I mean, they were dropping dead left and right. John Smith comes. McClay will cover John Smith because John Smith is a very textbooky kind of person to cover. Comes in and orders the society. He's also the person who will mainly be engaging in diplomacy with Powhatan and Pocahontas. And you know the story. You know where this goes, right? Powhatan takes John Smith captive, get ready to kill him, chop his head off. Pocahontas steps in. No, I love this man. Were John Smith and Pocahontas a thing? Like the SNL video we watched? No, John Smith was an old man. She was a young girl. It would have been like Joe Biden and Ariana Grande having a love affair. Like nobody wants to see that, right? Right, and that's so. There's no John Smith Pocahontas connection. So what's going on there? As best as we can tell, and I'll provide you some evidence in a few minutes, as best as we can tell, Powhatan, in his unusual way, was trying to communicate to John Smith, I'm your father. I'm your father. You're part of it. He was trying to adopt Smith, trying to adopt the English. Because this is what Native Americans did. When they encountered foreigners, they either wiped them out or they tried to adopt them. And so Powhatan, what he's trying to communicate to Smith is, hey, you, the English, you guys can stay here, but I'm dad. I'm dad in these parts. All right. So just like Powhatan had consolidated all these other nations under his authority, the English show up is like, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bring these guys in. They got some neat metalwork goods and stuff. They got these large sticks that go boom. Yeah. I think just call it Powhatan's Confederacy. I don't know that it had a particular name, like the Iroquois. We just know that it was like transnational. It was different nations that he had incorporated. Now he's trying to incorporate the English. So he's trying to bring Smith into the family. This is how Native Americans think. Diplomacy and family relations kind of go hand in hand. He's trying to bring Smith and the English into Powhatan's family, but as a child, as a subordinate. Powhatan is father in this region. He's trying to adopt John Smith as his son. Smith, as we know, if you've seen the Disney movie, Smith obviously doesn't get it. He really thinks Powhatan's trying to kill him. No, Powhatan was trying to, demonstrate a show of power to say, I could kill you if I wanted to. I'm not going to. Right? This whole thing was staged with Pocahontas stepping in. This whole thing was staged to try to communicate to Smith in English. You guys can stay here. Are you part of my family? You got to do what I say. I'm in charge. As I said, in times and places, Native Americans thought they could tell Europeans what to do, how to live. Doesn't work out. 1613. Smith is left by this point. Powhatan's Confederacy, the English settlers, they're at war. Very nasty war. Powhatan sends Matoka to try to negotiate peace. Instead, the English take her captive. Or captive for almost like a year. It's not John Smith, it's John Rolfe who figures out what to do. Rolfe is the savior in a couple ways of the English settlement. John Rolfe is the guy who figures out that gold in the Chesapeake comes in different form than gold. Gold comes in the form of tobacco. Rolfe had spent time down in the Caribbean. He had checked out conditions there. He saw this tobacco plant growing. Europeans love tobacco, not so much just to smoke it, but to snort it. Don't try that at home, kids. But they snorted the tobacco. Lovely habit. If you think smoking is bad, try snorting tobacco. But the Europeans love this thing. Rolfe goes to Virginia. He's like, I think tobacco could grow pretty good here. There's no gold laying around, but there's a lot of good land for growing tobacco. Rolfe is the one who introduces tobacco farming into the Chesapeake plantation, where it's going to become the cash crop of North America until the time of the American Revolution. Rolfe is also important though, because he's the one who figures out, hey, here's how we're going to bring peace. So I'll marry Amanut. She'll undergo Christian baptism. And the things will settle down. And so Rolfe marries Amanut. A little weird. Amanut already is married at this point. She has a husband already among her own people. So Rolfe marries a woman who is already married. Amanut gains a fourth name. Her Christian name is Rebecca. So Amanut, Pocahontas, Matoka, Rebecca is now married to John Rolfe, and things kind of settle down. Rolfe will take which name do you want to go with? Rebecca. Rolfe will take Rebecca with him back to England. You see some representations of Matoka going through baptism there. We're not sure about the large picture there, if that's an authentic, if that's a picture of her and Rolfe's son from England. We're not sure about that, but the one in kind of the center there, where she's in that robe, was how Rebecca is being dressed up when she's in England. What do you notice about, particularly that smaller middle picture of Rebecca? How is she being portrayed by the English? Who might she remind you of from that era, the early 1600s in England? Got any history buffs here who know their British crown? Elizabeth, yeah. If I didn't tell you, you might think, oh, that's Queen Elizabeth, or young Queen Elizabeth. No, that's actually Rebecca. That's Amanut. That's Matoka. That's Pocahontas. And so in representations, the English are trying to adopt Rebecca, show Rebecca can be, the savage girl can be tamed, can become a proper English woman on a model of Queen Elizabeth. Was Rebecca actually accepted into English society? No. And we know that from her own words. Good old John Smith, at least he wrote some things down. When Rebecca is in England, John Smith is offered one of his tours, decides to stop by, see his old friend. So he goes to visit Rebecca around 1617, 1618, somewhere around there. He goes and he writes down this account. So he goes to Rebecca. Rebecca says this to him, according to John Smith. You did promise Powhatan that what was, this is Pocahontas speaking to John Smith. You did promise Powhatan that what was yours should be his, and he the like to you. You called him father, being in his land a stranger, and by the same reason, so must I do you. Now, we learn a lot from that little recording of Rebecca's speech. Where did I get the idea that John Smith, that Powhatan was trying to adopt John Smith? This is pretty good testimony. What Rebecca was trying to say, don't you remember what went on back in the New World? Like you called Powhatan your father, and like you promised to share, like you guys promised to share the land, share the resources and stuff. Now Powhatan had tried to adopt Smith into English, into his tribe. And Rebecca's here like 4 or 5 years later trying to remind Smith, do you not understand what happened there? Now, how do we know Rebecca did not feel she'd been accepted by English society? She refers to herself indirectly here as a stranger. She recognizes herself as a stranger in a foreign land. Just like Smith was a stranger in Powhatan's land, Rebecca is now presenting herself to John Smith. I am a stranger in your land. And you called Powhatan father. Rebecca is now trying to tell John Smith, I'm going to call you father. Please accept me as your daughter. Everything that Rebecca has gone through, she's still relying upon the culture that she had grown up with to make sense of the world. And that was a world of extended kinship relations. It was a world of adoption. It was a world where if you're not going to kill each other, then you're going to adopt each other as family members, and you're going to share like you're part of a family. And still, with all that she's gone through, all the trauma she has experienced, she is still here in England trying to get John Smith to play by her rules, to play by Powhatan rules. We adopt each other. This is how the world works. So, just like Powhatan adopted you all those years ago, John, you need to adopt me. That's not John's culture. In John's world, who is Pocahontas? She's a princess. She's royalty. She's monarchy. Who's John Smith? He's a dirtbag. He is. I mean, he was. I mean, for all the, the veneration or textbooks and stuff, he was a dirtbag. And so he continues in his account and says, she wanted to call me father, like she's a princess. I'm below her. So here's Rebecca trying to convince John Smith, you got to adopt me. I'm going to call you father. And John Smith is like, no, you can't do that. You're royalty. You can't call me father. Rebecca insists. Were you not afraid to come into my father's country and cause fear in him and all his people, but me? She wasn't afraid, but all of his people said. In fear? You hear that I shall call you father? I tell you then I will. And you shall call me child. Until I will be forever and ever your countryman. She refuses to give up on her culture and her way of life. It is, as far as she's convinced, superior to anything. She actually goes on to complain about how the English lie all the time, which was if Europeans thought Native Americans were always like wandering around, Native Americans thought Europeans lied all the time. You said you're going to do this, now you're doing this. Here's Pocahontas calling Smith and people liars. Still at the end of her life, all that she's gone through, she's still trying to get John Smith to play by her rules, to get John Smith to adopt her. This is the way the world works. You either get adopted or you adopt. This is how the world is supposed to work for Native Americans, not just for the Iroquois. Like I said, all Native American nations had some kind of adoption system by which they could take foreigners, even Europeans, who they weren't even quite sure were human. We'll see that again in the film we're going to watch on Thursday. You'd still find ways of adopting them as family members in their tribe. Radically so, as we saw in the testimony of World War II. Nevertheless, the English don't get it. So what is the significance of the Pocahontas story? It's not that love can triumph over cultural differences. It doesn't. There is no love here. We have in the Pocahontas story is a story of two failed adoptions. The failure of Smith and the English to accept adoption by Powhatan, and the failure of Smith and the English to adopt. Rebecca is one of the ones. Sorry, I mean to bust up Pocahontas, but there you go. Write a nasty letter to Disney. How could you do this to us? The Pocahontas story is significant for another reason. It highlights, let's move beyond that. It highlights that, the middle ground that I talked about between the French and Native American tribes, particularly in the Great Lakes region, the Huron, the Algonquin, not so much the Iroquois. That middle ground is really not there between Native Americans and English. It's there, and for different reasons. Is it that the French or is it that the English are just more intolerant, just less accepting than the French? Possibly. I think it's just the patterns of settlement are different. The French are they're not coming in huge numbers. 80 years after Quebec is settled, and still only got about 3,000 people. This is not that many Frenchmen. And so they had to have more cooperative relationships with Native Americans. The English, you'll read about this in Massachusetts, those Puritans, they established present-day Massachusetts, New England in 1629, a couple hundred of them. 11 years later, there's like 30,000 of them. I mean, they're just flooding out of England. And unlike the Chesapeake, where like hundreds are coming in and hundreds are dying every year, in New England, hundreds are coming in and they're settling down, they're becoming farmers, or having babies, and they want more land. It's just that community in New England is an instant success. But that puts it in a very difficult situation with Native American tribes in the region. So it's more than just simply there's something wrong with the English and the French are more tolerant. I don't think it's that. I think it's just there's a lot more English, and they're coming in after the French, and Native Americans were just a lot less trustful of any Europeans coming in, particularly in the numbers that the New Englanders are coming in. But whatever the reasons, the point simply is this: when you look at English and Native American relations, there's just a lot less war. It's a lot more a history of almost immediate war. The French leadership will eventually start using a language of extermination. Even Jesuit priests, one Jesuit priest who would say, around 1660, we must exterminate all the tribes in this region, or Christianity itself will die out in Europe. I don't want to say there's nothing to a genocide narrative. The reality is that eventually all Europeans started talking the language of genocide. We can't convert them. We have to exterminate them. Exterminate. It's not my word. It's the word you see the Jesuits themselves using. You see the English using words like exterminate as early as 1622. They're talking about wiping out Native Americans. All, just a few years after settlement. There's just not a lot of middle ground. It's not entirely absent, but there's just not as much. The English came here wanting a lot and expecting a lot. John Winthrop was the first governor of Massachusetts, Puritan pastor. He leaves the Puritans. Don't confuse the Puritans with the Pilgrims, that whole Thanksgiving thing. That's Plymouth Rock, 1620. It's a different group. The group that's settling New England, and again, this is all textbook stuff. McClay will talk about this, so I don't need to go into great detail. I don't want to, frankly, spend a lot of time talking about Europeans, apart from talking about Native Americans. This is one of the problems we have with our history, is that what you get in schools is just all the different Europeans, and here's this group that came and what they did and what they thought, and here's this group that came and what they did and what they thought. Well, what about the people who are actually here? What about the people who actually have already settled the Americans? What about them? What did they think about it? That's what we're trying to focus on. Winthrop and the Puritans, in coming to Massachusetts in 1629, they already had kind of a mission. They already kind of worked through some of these questions, right? I mean, one of the central questions that maybe has occurred to you or should have occurred to you is, why did any European think that they could come to land that was already settled by people? Why did they think they could come here and settle themselves? What gave them the right? What gave Europeans the right to settle on land that other people had already settled? What gave the right to think it was out of their land? Winthrop already is asking that question and trying to provide an answer there. Number 3 there, this land grows weary of it. He's talking about England. Like, why are the Puritans, why are so many? Why are tens of thousands of people looking to get out of England? England is a place of scarcity, particularly in the 1600s. It's a place of scarcity. It's a growing population, and it's an island, right? It's got finite resources and a growing population. England needs to get rid of its population. It needs to export its people. Winthrop is saying there. So where are they going to go? Well, it's this New World thing. What's this number 4? The whole earth is the Lord's garden. He has given it as the sons of men with the general commission, Genesis 1:28, to increase and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, which is again renewed under Noah. You guys ever hear the talk in church or in Sunday school, the Genesis mandate? God created Adam and Eve, and he gave them a mission. Be fruitful and multiply. Not just have a lot of babies. That is part of it. Have a lot of babies and go all over the earth. Just go everywhere. Make something of it. Or subdue is a wonderful King James Bible word. But subdue it. And so what Winthrop and the Puritans, what's their justification for the new world? Hey, God told us to do it. God told us to go wherever there's land, where there's an abundance of land, wherever there's land that hasn't been subdued, God's told us we should go out and subdue it. So we're just being good Christians. It's kind of saying, continuing on, like, why would we not do this? This is dumb. In the meantime, why would we suffer a whole continent as fruitful and convenient for the use of man to lie waste without any improvement? This word improvement is a word that we'll see, not just here, we'll see it again in this class in the 1800s. It's a very important word in American history. It is the word that justifies what Europeans do in North America. We'll see Andrew Jackson talk about improvements all the way in the 1830s to justify the Trail of Tears, forced migration of Native Americans from the eastern part of the United States out to present-day Oklahoma. And Jackson's justification for that was Native Americans aren't improving the land. They're not doing anything with it. So we need to kick them out. So we, European descendants, can do something with that land. When Jackson makes that claim, he's just continuing a line of argument going all the way back to the Puritans and John Winthrop back in the 1620s. What right do we have to take the land from Native Americans? They're not doing anything with it. They don't know what to do with the land. They don't know how to improve it. What is it? What did he mean? I think he meant Native Americans weren't farmers. They weren't farmers. And again, we're back to this kind of wandering versus fixed way of life, where the Native Americans, they were migratory people. They didn't settle the land. Talked about this the other day. Native Americans lived incredibly purposeful lives. And yes, a lot did migrate around. It didn't mean that they didn't use the land or didn't know how to use and navigate the land. They just used it differently than Europeans did. Well, it's not a good enough justification for winter. If you're not a farmer, you're not raising crops, even though Native Americans would actually have to teach the Europeans how to grow corn. That is one of the ironies. Native Americans aren't farmers, so we can take their lands. We can teach them how to be farmers. It's actually the Americans who have, in some ways, to teach the Europeans how to farm or what to farm. Europeans don't bring corn, they bring pigs. Well, we'll talk about the pigs. Pigs weren't too great because all the Native American tribes that did grow crops, that had settled down, were farmers. The European pigs came in and just destroyed their crops. So yeah, it's, when you start digging into the details of this stuff, it's a crazy line of argument, but it's all here with Winthrop saying, what is our right to take the land from the Native Americans? For one, it's, well, there's enough land to go. We can share. I mean, that's one argument. Maybe that's true when there's a couple of hundred Puritans. When there's 30,000, it's a little bit harder to make that argument. But the other argument is a theological argument. God told us to go out and improve the earth. Native Americans aren't doing it. We know how to do it. So we're going to go and take the land. We're going to go and settle the land. And we're going to improve it. And God will bless us. Remember the Massachusetts Bay symbol? Come over and help us. Right? I mean, that's what Winthrop is kind of suggesting here. Native Americans, they're helpless. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to live life properly. So we Puritans, we're going to go over, we're going to settle Massachusetts. We're going to show them how to do things in life. It's really hard. My point is this, it's really hard with this kind of theological rationale to find a middle ground with Native Americans, to figure out how to get along. The Puritans are coming in with an imperialistic project. We are going to take land that other people inhabit, but God is telling us that we have to do it. It's part of the Genesis mandate. And Americans would justify the continuing appropriation of Native American lands century after century into the 19th century, even into part of the 20th century. Not until the 1930s that the United States actually starts giving land back to tribes. The justification again and again and again is Native Americans don't know what to do with the land. Europeans do. But here's the thing. Not only were the Native Americans not helpless, they actually thought that their way of life was superior to the Puritan/European way. They thought that they were true men. And the Puritans, well, they weren't even sure that they were human beings. And so you had not just one people. That's, again, the way we tell our story, it's usually like, wow, the Europeans had this superiority complex. Native Americans had that too. When they encountered the Europeans, Native Americans looked at the Europeans and thought everything the Europeans did was stupid, dumb, that they didn't know how to live. You know, I mean, here the English are coming in thinking Native Americans like, come over and help us. These Europeans are showing up and they don't know what to do. Native Americans are like, guys are helpless. People don't know what they're doing. Should we help them out? Should we kill them? What should we do? This is the actual history of what happened. It's not Europeans coming in and forcing their will and way of life over a helpless people. It's two peoples, both convinced that their way of life is best, coming into conflict with each other. Now, in the English case, as I said, there's a lot less middle ground. More immediately, what you find is warfare and near constant warfare. You found that in the Chesapeake, right? They're settling Jamestown in 1607. 1613, they're in all-out war with Powhatan's Confederacy. Massachusetts is getting settled in 1629. 1637, there's already a regional war between the Puritans and Pilgrims on one side, Native American tribes on the other. Actually, some Native American tribes actually fought for the Puritans and the Pilgrim side. One of the more heinous events that come out of the Pequot War, one of the most heinous events in American history, was the Mystic Massacre of 1637. This is William Bradford. William Bradford was the governor of the Pilgrim Plymouth plantation, the whole Thanksgiving thing. But that's another one of those things. So the Thanksgiving story, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, they can get along with each other, right? The story doesn't end with Thanksgiving. It ends with the Mystic Massacre. The Pilgrims, the Puritan allies and Native American allies, they went to a village in which there were only women and children. All male warriors were out, preparing to battle somewhere else. And so, at this place around the Mystic River, Puritans, Pilgrims, allies came and assembled. They set the village on fire. There's women and children, non-combatants in it. Set the village on fire. When the women and kids tried to escape, if they tried to escape, they ran out. Pilgrims killed them. It was a massacre. It was a genocide of peaceful people on tribe. This is Bradford's account. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire and the streams of blood quenching the sink. There's so much blood that the fire is being put out by the flows of blood. And horrible was the stink and the stench thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave prayers, meaning the Pilgrims, gave prayers thereof to God who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands and give them so speedy victory over so proud and insulting an enemy, like non-combatant women and children. Here is the governor of the Plymouth plantation thanking God that they were able to take the lives of hundreds of women and children. This is the story of the English settlement in North America. I don't know that McClay will talk about the Pequot Massacre or not. I'm not sure how much he's going to get into that. You know, one of the things that McClay and I struggle over is where you focus the story of American history. You focus it in the Puritans who were trying to build a model Christian society, or does the story of American history lie in a group of Christians trying to build a model Christian society who also engaged in genocide. Where does the heart of American history lie? Does it rely in a pursuit of religious utopia? Does it lie in acts of genocide committed by professing Christians? Thanking God for that victory. And you got to try to put McClay and I together somehow. You got to try to fit us together. Well, I talked with him about once. Good guy. I like him. But in terms of trying to square the lectures in the textbook, I don't envy you. So there's not a lot of middle ground. There's a lot of bloodshed between Native Americans and Europeans, between Native Americans and English. That doesn't mean that the middle ground is entirely not good. Yes, it's true. Pilgrims went to war against Native American tribes at the drop of the hat, but they also tried to do the Jesuit thing too. They also tried to provide for a conversion of Native Americans too. Along Jesuit lines, remember we talked about the Jesuits, trying to convert Native Americans, and they say, you know what? It's not enough just to go out and baptize these people. What we need to do is we need to build New France here in North America. We need to build up a kind of model Christian society here in North America. And if we do that, Native Americans will recognize the superiority of a fixed farming, English-speaking, English clothes-wearing kind of life, and they'll settle down around us, and then we can teach Christian. So that's what the French were saying. The French never get the numbers to do that. The English do, right? I mean, they're here within 10 years. They're here by the tens of thousands. It's a Puritan, John Eliot, who gets the idea for the praying towns as they come to be known. The praying towns is essentially what the Jesuits tried to do but failed to do. It's let's build up model Christian societies of us Puritans, and then let's invite Native Americans to come and live around us, to learn from us, interact with us. And just like with the Jesuits, Eliot was not just simply interested in, well, I need to go out and share Jesus with, for instance, he spent most of his time among the Natik tribe. I need to go out and give the Natik tribe Jesus. It was more than that. Just like with the Jesuits, Eliot believed that a cultural conversion had to come first before a religious conversion. This is what Eliot wrote in this book. He says, until Indians were, in his word, come up unto civil cohabitation, government, and labor, which a fixed condition of life will put upon them, they were not so capable to be trusted with the treasure of Christ, lest they should scandalize the saints. We shouldn't even go out and talk about Jesus with the Native Americans in New England. We shouldn't even go out and talk about Jesus. What we need to do is go out and talk about Wendell Berry. Yeah, my core 2 6 right here. We need to go out and convince them to stop wandering around and fix condition of life. We need to convince them to become farmers and settle around our towns where we can teach them how to speak properly and to do family and gender relations properly, and to dress right, and then we can talk Jesus. We need to change the culture, and then they'll be ready to do Jesus. One of Eliot's contemporaries put it this way: we must make men of them before we can hope to see them saints. They must be civilized before they could become Christians. Part of the reason I stress this is because I want you to understand how different that is from the world that we live in today. You just don't hear, rightfully so, you don't hear missionaries saying, we need to go out and change their culture, and then we can preach to them. Most missionaries today have accepted cultural relativism, meaning that, cultures are just, cultures are cultures. They're not necessarily good or bad. And so we don't need to, we shouldn't, not only, do we not have to change a person's culture, we probably shouldn't be trying to change the culture. Rather, we should be trying to figure out how we communicate Jesus to these different cultures. The Jesuits had a little bit of that in that they were willing to learn Native American languages. The English, not so much at all. Just understand how different the past can be. Missionaries at this time, yes, but missionaries who believe we needed to go out and change their culture. We needed to change their way of life. We needed to bring them under a kind of, frankly, a military submission, not just political submission. And then we could talk Jesus. But not until we brought them under our master. So we need to understand the relationship between Christianity and imperialism. They go hand in hand. Certainly in this period of time. And so Eliot wants to build the praying towns. He starts with the Natiques. This model does spread out. I believe at the time of King Philip's War in 1676, there's an estimated about 13 praying towns spread throughout Puritan New England, and possibly as many as 10,000 Native Americans who lived in these praying towns. So a lot better than anything the Jesuits had been able to do. This praying town model seems to be working. These Native Americans are coming, they're settling around Puritan towns in the outskirts. They're settling down and looking to seemingly learn from their new Puritan master. A couple of things though. King Philip. You guys know 1776. Another date that like every American should probably know besides 1776 is 1676. 1676 was a truly apocalyptic year in American history. You had two of the worst conflicts ever on British North American soil. In the South, you had Bacon's Rebellion. We'll talk more about that in a future lecture. In New England, you had King Philip's. Where King Philip, his Native American name was Metacom, did not like the fact that his peoples were settling around joining these praying towns, and Metacom went to war against the Puritans. It initially had some significant success. A lot of people died. In fact, until the Civil War, King Philip's War was the bloodiest war to take place in British soil. Now, nowhere near the numbers of the Civil War, but the population was just so much smaller at this time. The population that was there versus the population that died, it truly was a catastrophic event. Only I think one of the praying towns actually reopened up at King Philip's War, the Native plantation. And so, would the Puritan model have worked? Would this praying town thing have worked long term had it not been for this historical accident of King Philip's War? We don't know. It did, and so this war severely disrupted the praying town model. But here's something we know too from research, and particularly into the Native. Yes, Native Americans were coming and they're settling themselves down in these praying towns, but they have to ask Just like when we ask, like, why were all those Native Americans being baptized by Jesuits? We have to ask, why were these Native Americans coming and settling around these Puritan towns? Is it because they thought the English were superior? Is it because they thought the English Jesus was superior to anything they did? No, there's almost no evidence of that. So why did they come? In some cases, they came because they were the only members left of their tribe. The tribe had been wiped out by war and by disease. And so in coming to settle around, in coming to settle in a praying town, they were in some ways trying to find a way to continue their way of life. And here's the irony of the praying town. It would be easy to say, oh, look at the success the Puritans were having in converting these Native Americans. The reality is that Native Americans were using the Puritans. Not in all cases, but in many cases, the Native Americans were using the Puritans, using their supplies, using their resources in order to rebuild Native America. Native Americans were coming and finding community, but not community among the Puritans. They were coming and finding community among other Native Americans who themselves had experienced similar trauma, who themselves had experienced similar loss. And so these praying towns were probably less about Native conversions to European ways of life, and probably more about Native Americans using Europeans in order to try to restore some semblance of a traditional Native way. There's a book on this, The Indian's Great Awakening, if you want to learn more about this. And so, even without King Philip's War, it appears that the English are having about as much success as the French and the Jesuits did at converting Native Americans. It's just not happening. All right. The praying town model doesn't really work. Eventually, the English start establishing Indian schools in North America, where they would forcibly take Native American children, bring them to these schools, run by British missionaries. The testimonies we have of the missionaries who ran these schools is that they're not working either. What these schools were doing were creating a hybrid generation of people who did not fit anywhere. They didn't fit in Native American culture anymore, and they were not accepted into British culture. And so all kinds of abuse, alcohol abuse, substance abuse ran through these schools. As these kids, they really had nowhere to go. They could not go back to a traditional tribe or way of life. That was gone, but they also were not going to be accepted by Europeans too. So my point is, when we look at English attempts to win the culture war among Native Americans, probably the best thing we could say is fail. That's probably the best thing we could say. We factor in things like the Mystic Massacre. There's a lot worse things we could say about English-Native American relations. But again, we can't stop the story here. The story doesn't end with the English tried to convert Native Americans and they failed. That's only one half of the story. Because Native American tribes, just like they tried to with the Jesuits, Native Americans are trying to convert the English. Native Americans, just like they tried to adopt the French, Native Americans are trying to adopt the English. And just like they had with the French, Native Americans are having more success in adopting the English than the English are in converting Native Americans. One of our sources of evidence for this are the captivity narratives that the English wrote. Captivity narratives are just what they sound like. They're narratives of people who were taken captive by Native American tribes. Now, these stories were supposed to be stories of triumph of the English way of life. These were supposed to be stories of people who, for whatever reason, found themselves taken into captivity by savages, having to come face to face with barbarism, with the absence of civilization. But the fact that they write these captivity narratives suggests that they eventually got freed somehow. And these stories are supposed to be stories of triumph, just like Mary Rowlandson is one of the more famous captivity narratives. Just like Mary triumphed over her Native American kidnappers. So ultimately, English Christianity will triumph here in the New World. So the captivity narratives were intended to be cultural affirmation, cultural celebration, imperial affirmation, imperial celebration of what the English are trying to do in the New World. That's what they were supposed to be. But sometimes they weren't that. You read some of the captivity narratives and you find some surprising things. Like Mary Jemison's captivity narrative, for instance. Jemison was taken captive at the age of 15 by the Sanka tribes. She eventually is freed and writes up her captivity narrative. And rather than reaffirming the English mission to the New World, she subverts it to her story. She writes in her story, and I have to paraphrase, I don't have the exact quotations on the paper anymore. Jemison writes, I was accepted into their family as though I had been born of that tribe. And we know her account is true because so many other of these white Indians said the same thing. Native Americans, once they adopt you, that's it. You're part of the family. I was treated, I mean, here I'm a 15-year-old, I'm a foreigner. I look different, I talk different. But they accepted me as part of the family. I was a sister. I was a daughter. She says the moral character of the natives was uncontaminated. Now, the Europeans, Native Americans don't even have a moral character. They're savages, they're barbarians, they're heathens. All that means that there is no moral character. There is no capacity for morality among Native Americans for the Europeans. No, Jemison says, and so many other Europeans, English testified to exactly the same thing. You told me growing up, these Native Americans are savages, they have no moral code. I'm here to tell you, not only do they have a moral code, but it's uncontaminated. It's a good moral code. It's one they actually follow. Like I said, Native Americans, the Europeans, they thought Native Americans were always wandering around. Main complaints Native Americans had about Europeans. You can't trust them. They're liars. Always lying. You can't trust a word they say. Right? I mean, here, Europeans are saying, Native Americans are savages, they don't have any moral code. Native Americans are saying, these Europeans, they don't have any moral code. You can't trust a single word they say. Jemison is saying, yeah, that's what I found too. These, the Senecas that I grew up with, they have a moral code and they stick to it. What they say is what they mean, what they do. And then Jemison deals the death blow. She says, do they, meaning the English, do they ever adopt an enemy? And call them by the tender name of brother? The first answer is no. We have no accounts of the English adopting Native Americans, accepting Native Americans as leaders or even brothers and sisters in English society. It's not happening. And it's ironic, right? Because what's theoretically the moral theological code of the English? It's Christianity. Christianity is kind of big on an expanding family, right? You guys read Galatians 3:23 lately? Here there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, but Christ is all and in all. Right? The church, Christianity in particular, is supposed to be a border-breaking institution. All these barriers that we set up along the lines of race, ethnicity, even gender, Christianity says these things don't matter as much as finding equality. This is sometimes called in Christianity the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of humankind. This is probably expanded to say the brotherhood and sisterhood of humankind. They all come from one mom and one dad. You might have noticed in the syllabus that I put a verse, Acts 17:26. That was from a sermon that Paul gave at Athens. Paul was asked by the Greek, he was in there preaching to the Jews in Athens. The Greek philosophers came to Paul and said, "Hey, you got some interesting ideas here. Would you come up and explain them to us?" Mars Hill. By the way, any of you going on the Greece trip, you actually can go. Like Mars Hill is still there, so you can go and stand where Paul stood and give that message. But Paul stands before a group of Greek intellectuals, and here's the thing: before Paul was a Christian, what was Paul doing? Who was Paul? He was super Jew, right? He wasn't an ordinary Jew. He was super Jew. How did Jews think about non-Jews? How did he think about Gentiles, like Greeks, Romans? They were dogs. Paul goes and stands up before this group of people that a few years before he would have considered to be a bunch of dogs and unclean. He never would have done. Not only does he go and stand in their presence, but he delivers a sermon, part of which is Acts 17:26. You can look it up for yourself, where he affirms from all the nations are made of one blood. That's the King James version. Of one blood. Meaning, what Paul's trying to say is that God made all the nations of one blood. He's affirming that Genesis story is like, God created Adam and Eve, and like Adam and Eve, like that's our mom, dad, and human race. Paul's reaffirming that in Acts 17:26. He's standing before a group of people that he previously would have considered to be dogs and unclean, and he's saying, hey, we're all part of a family that God has created. It is one of the most remarkable border-busting sermons you find in all of the Bible. Paul to deliver that message. So you would think that Christians would have been accepting of the stranger, and in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the whole love your enemies thing. I mean, there are so many moral and ethical resources in the New Testament that for people that prided themselves on being Christians, and the Puritans prided themselves on being God's chosen nation, the new Israel, you would think that these guys, more than anyone, would be able to practice the Christian faith. Jemison says no. In fact, you find you find English who had encountered in some way or taken captive in some kind of way by Native Americans. You find them again and again and again saying the same thing. Native Americans are the true Christians. Native Americans are the true Christians. Now, personally, I think that's going too far, right? Native Americans are not, they're not actually Christian. They don't have much interest in being Christian. But I know what people, when they give that testimony, what they're getting at. What they're trying to communicate is, hey, all the kinds of things, all the kinds of practices, all the kind of acceptance that Christians should be demonstrating to their enemies, Native Americans are doing it. English Christians don't know the first thing about Christianity. You want to find Christianity in the New World? got to look to the Native American tribes. They're the ones doing it. That's the Jamison message. It's a message of a lot of captivity narratives. And it's, it kind of affirms what we talked about before. Native Americans, not only are they fighting this culture war with Europeans, they're actually winning it. Right? You don't find Native Americans say, yeah, the English, they really know how to do life well. But you find thousands of testimonies, well, hundreds of testimonies of Europeans, in this case, even the English, saying these Native Americans, they got it going on. They know Jesus better than the Christians. Let's end with Eunice Williams' story. Eunice was the daughter of John Williams. John Williams is a prominent Puritan pastor in Deerfield, Massachusetts. In 1705, Deerfield will be attacked by a group of French Mohawks. The Mohawks who had pledged their loyalty to the French crown. They had undergone baptism. They attacked Deerfield in 1705. They kill about 60 people. They take about 120 captive. Because this is what the Iroquois are doing at this point, right? They're killing less people. They're taking more people captive because people are more useful alive rather than dead. Even if what the Iroquois are going to do are like engage in ritual sacrifice of some of the people that are taken captive. So the Mohawk take about 120 captive from Deerfield, including John and his family. John's wife and his infant son will die on the way back to the French Mohawk village. But John's got 2 older sons, and then Eunice, who is 6 at this time. They all make it back to this French Mohawk village. And that's where they're going to live for a couple of years. News travel's a little slow at this time, so it takes the Puritan leadership a little bit of time to figure out like what exactly happened. Whereas is John still alive? Once they figure out that John's still alive, he's kind of a big name in Puritan circles. So like, you got to get John back. The Iroquois, they loved playing this game, right? They would take people captive, give them to the French, and the French would say, "Oh yeah, you want John back? Okay, well you got to give us, that French guy you took captive." And and the Native American, the Iroquois are just kind of watching the French and English go back and forth at each other, just kind of laughing because it's like as long as the French and English are fighting each other, they're not fighting Native Americans. So anything that the Iroquois could do to kind of get the pressure off themselves, in this case by taking people captive, giving them to the French giving the English, and on and on. John and his 2 sons are released from Mohawk custody. Eunice stays. Eunice does not leave. You might say, how could any father leave his daughter? I imagine that was a pretty tough call, but he had 2 sons to take care. So he left. While he's trying to make arrangements to get Eunice freed, he hears the only thing worse than finding out your kid has gone native for a Protestant. The only thing worse finding your kid has gone native is finding your kid has gone Catholic. And John finds out that Eunice has been baptized into the Catholic Church. Well, that's it. It's an all uplifts now. He's got to get Eunice back. John and his 2 sons, they travel to the village to meet with Eunice, to tell her time to come home. They meet with Eunice. Eunice doesn't leave. A few years later, they come back again, meet with Eunice. Eunice doesn't leave. A 3rd time they go. Eunice won't even meet with him the 3rd time. That's the question is why? Why won't Eunice leave? Here's the great thing about Eunice Williams. We don't have a single word that she spoke. We have no idea. There's no written record whatsoever of anything that she spoke. There's a whole book, a 250-page book called The Unredeemed Captive, all about Eunice Williams. How do you write a book about somebody who you don't even know a single word that they spoke? It's a great book. Before the story is coming. We don't know. From her own words, we don't know. But from the captivity narratives, and the Mary Jemison, and Old White Chiefs, and all these other testimonies, we know why Eunice did. We know simple psychology and socialization. Age 6, what other family did she know than the one she was adopted into? But we also know that Europeans who were adopted into Native American tribes really liked what they saw, really liked what they experienced. Their life was not one of savagery, evilness. It was one of the people who take care of each other, who accepted each other, radically accepted strangers as part of their family. One writer put it this way: your Eunice Williams, they quote, found a life singularly captivating. And captivating there has such a wonderful double meaning, because how did most of these Eunice Williams find themselves in the situations they were put in? They were taken captive. Right? They were forced to be adopted. But once they were captivated by what they saw, by what they experienced, by what they learned. And so Eunice Williams is yet another example of a white Indian. Among story after story after story we have of the white Indian. Now, I mean, we know who wins the culture war just because they won the political and military war. Well, more than that, right? Europeans won the biological war, a war people didn't even necessarily know was going on. Europeans won a biological war here in North America. We don't know exactly how many Native Americans died of European diseases. It's in the millions. We don't fully know. We don't know. Estimates of Native populations in the 1600s range from about 2 million to 12 million. So we don't know if we know it's in the millions. Is it in the tens of millions? We don't know. Now, and then understand, this is just North America. If we're going to factor in Central and South America, then not only are we in the tens of millions, we are potentially in the hundreds of millions. We just don't know. But we do know the Europeans won the cultural war because they won the biological. Native Americans dying left and right from disease made it impossible for them to put up a united political front, military front, but even a cultural front against Europeans. And so we know how this story plays out. We know that North America, that in 1492 was owned by millions of Native American population. By 1776, is in a very different place. And that story of displacement will continue to play out all the way into the 19th, even into the 20th century. They said it's not, we don't even, Native American populations don't even begin to start recovering numbers. They don't start recovering land until well into the 20th century. So we know who ultimately wins the culture war. But we still have to recognize in times and places, particularly between, I would say, 1500 and 1650, we have to recognize that French, the English, Native Americans in North America, they occupied in times and places in middle ground. And they fought on equal footing on that ground. And they fought for whose way of life was better. And the evidence overwhelmingly is that Native Americans were better at winning over Europeans, and Europeans were winning over Native Americans. And this shouldn't surprise us. All right. Got a lot of athletes in here. Wouldn't you always prefer to play on your home field? Isn't it always better, almost always better to play in your home field, have a home field advantage? Native Americans had a home field advantage. So the story that told of cultural conquest, not by the Europeans, but by the Native Americans, should not surprise you. It was Native American land. They had home field advantage. It shouldn't surprise us that in times and places, they beat the Europeans. Europeans tried to convert Native Americans and failed. No, we're not passing. Europeans tried to convert Native Americans and failed. Native Americans tried to adopt Europeans. And in times and places enjoyed some significant success. All right, we're going to watch a movie on Thursday that will help dramatize, hopefully not traumatize, but help dramatize some of the things I've been talking about. For those of you headed to Cedar Bend later that day, it will also be a nice tutorial.